Everyone, thanks for coming back. So it wasn't that bad if you're coming back. Wanted to pick up part 2 of the perception lecture. You recall I had gotten through point number 2 here, how perception was accomplished, at least part of that anyway. One of the way it's accomplished is through external sources, and that was after spending a lot of time establishing the importance of perception in that intro. Let me pick it up right there then where we left off, which is how is it accomplished? External sources to be sure, but quite often internal sources as well. Sometimes we just take information and play with it and maneuver it around, use some sort of internal calculus to figure out impressions of other people or whatever. And there's a lot of research on this. But those are internal sources. I wanted to give you a couple examples of those as well. The first one I'll talk about, but not too long, because it's certainly not a preferred way for us to get information about other people. Our book calls this, by the way, this whole field of research, person perception. That is, we're sitting around watching other people. So it bears value that sometimes people tell us about themselves. We take that in and we do something with it. Now, when people tell us about themselves, say we have a term for that, psychologists do, and it's called self-disclosure. Self-disclosure means all on their own. People have revealed information about themselves, of course. Now, self-disclosure, we take that and we weigh it appropriately. Sometimes we weigh it a little bit, but more often than not, we give it very, very low weight. We do not prefer self-disclosure as a way to figure out other people. We are very skeptical of self-disclosure for pretty good reasons. One is that some people just don't know themselves very well, so what they're saying it's just inaccurate. It doesn't jive with reality. In another case, of course, maybe people do know themselves, but they're managing the impression. They're not telling the complete truth that they may know about themselves. For either reason, though, we're very skeptical of self-disclosure. I'll give you an example. I don't know if you fly a lot. I fly to a degree and used to a lot more when I was with AT&T, and you'd run into people. You'd be sitting next to them on the airplane as the plane was getting ready to taxi off, and even in that first 5 minutes of a 2-hour flight, boy, you would get so much information about this person, in some cases some personal details that were quite revealing or intimate, and boy, it's kind of an odd feeling. So there can be inappropriate self-disclosure as well. So for all those reasons, we don't like this self-disclosure. In fact, it's pretty clear that we much prefer to watch and record other people's behavior ourselves. Definitely our preferred method across people. It's one of the principles of human behavior here in terms of perception. We definitely like that. And we like to do it in surreptitious ways even. Ways that people maybe don't know we're watching, because we believe that's the most informative about what they're truly like. And that's valuable information. When you're doing business with someone and you want to try to figure them out, you got a partner, you're interviewing somebody, all of this is of great value. Watching and recording behavior all on your own. And again, as I said earlier, we could fess this up and give it a complex term, but frankly, that's what it is. We love watching and recording other people. We do it a lot. We do it all the time. If you were in front of me and this was the first lecture in the class, I would have already done it. I would have already watched and recorded all of you and probably drawn some initial conclusions and you about me. So that's really what it is. We sit around or walk around and watch and record other people's behavior. Now, I made that sound easy, and it does sound kind of easy, and it's not inaccurate, but it's much, much more challenging than what it sounds. There are lots of potential barriers in the way for us watching and recording, and what's unfortunate is that we love it, and we think we're extremely good at it, but yet we don't give enough appreciation to those challenges, which actually can constrain and distort our perception. So it sounds really easy, but boy, is it tough to have a dispassionate, completely accurate view of other people. And so that's what I want to spend some time talking about, why, even though it sounds easy and we much prefer to watch and record, why that is fraught with some difficulty. Two ways it's fraught with difficulty are that, unfortunately, or fortunately, we are very active social perceivers. We're involved a lot, maybe because we like it, maybe because some people love it. But either way, we are involved to a degree, and in some cases whether we know it or not. And I don't know if you've heard this language before. You saw some of it in the book. A lot of human behavior, people draw analogies to the theater. So you'll see references to roles in our book when we talk about stress, right? Role stress. You'll see things like actors. Well, that actor did this, or that audience did this, and there's a script. And so we're going to use those terms throughout this dramaturgical view of human behavior. And sure enough, here it is here. We as audiences, and that's really what we are when we're sitting watching and recording other people. We're an audience watching them. As it turns out, we don't completely process everything that's going on, as I said, in a rational, dispassionate way. There are some cases when we play with that information, and it can present challenges. One of those is called extraction, audience extraction. We as audiences sometimes literally extract behavior from people that they may not otherwise perform. I used to have this feeling. I grew up in California. My parents lived out there until they passed away recently. But you know, even in my 30s, when I'd go back, and I have been gone from the house for years and years. Even when I went back in my 30s, it was really odd because I felt like the way I was being treated, and it was all very kind and with the best of intentions, of course, but I felt like I was back in high school, you know, and I acted that way too, and unwittingly in some cases. So it almost extracts that behavior out of you when people have these expectations, and that's exactly what the self-fulfilling prophecy is all about. Audience extraction is also known as the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's also known as the Pygmalion effect, thanks to George Bernard Shaw, who wrote that play upon which the movie My Fair Lady was made, if you're familiar with that. It's exactly illustrative of the audience extraction, the self-fulfilling prophecy effect. It's often called the Pygmalion effect because in Greek mythology, Pygmalion, you can see here in this photo, was a sculptor, and he fell in love with his statues, and they sort of came alive in his mind anyway. And so you can see the analogy. This Pygmalion effect involves creating something based on our expectations. My parents had those expectations. They weren't stated, but they were subtle, and obviously I reacted to them at least early on. These Pygmalion effects, these self-fulfilling prophecies, are really very common. You see them in managers and teachers and many others where studies have been done. One of the most classic studies of this very phenomenon was done among teachers. Very famous study done in social science by Robert Rosenthal, a really inventive researcher from Harvard. He did this study, and perhaps you've heard of it, where he went to a school, and in various parts of the school he would talk to teachers, and he did this experiment, literally an experiment, where he told some classes, some teachers of some classes, he said, look, he'd bring them in, they meet with a principal, they were talking about a research study they were doing this term to follow kids up, and he said, look, you've got a set of kids that have really high achievement scores this year, and we just wanted you to know that, and as we monitor them during the year and collect data, we just thought that might be useful. Another set of teachers, often in the same grades, he again did a lot of really complex controls to try to remove any extraneous explanations. Another set of teachers weren't told anything. They were just told the usual. Hey, you have the usual set of students, but in this case, we're also, the same thing you did before, we're going to do a research study, we're going to be collecting data all the time, we wanted you to know. So the only thing that differed across the two conditions were that some teachers were told they had high performers, some weren't told anything, and they assumed they had the usual level with a variance of performance. Now, as it turns out, there were no differences in those students, in fact, no differences at all. But what he observed was that the teachers had these expectations, and it seemed to draw behavior out. So they did better. Those students did better in their teacher's class for whom there were high expectations set. And it wasn't just behavioral. He also looked at performance. He saw IQ differences. So this wasn't simply a perceptual or self-report phenomenon among teachers. They actually moved their behavior. So it's really quite amazing. Teachers apparently treated these high performers differently. They almost drew that out of these kids. There's some really interesting implications of the study. Number one, boy, maybe people are capable of a lot more than we think they are. And so what you'll see when you get to motivation, the motivation chapter and section, is there's a whole theory based on this, that, and you can see what the implications are. Basically, they say that we should all have high expectations for our employees, and maybe everybody wouldn't meet them, but overall, we're going to get better performance. It could be due to this self-fulfilling prophecy effect. This has also been shown with lots of other, it's been shown with managers, it's been shown with, I just read a recent study among Israeli tank commanders. You know, they were told the same thing during their boot camp, teaching these tank officers how to, and enlisted men, how to operate these extremely complex, multi-million-dollar machines. They went through a 16-week period of training. But at the beginning of that period, again, some commanders were told, hey, you have a group that really scored very high on proficiency tests. We're going to study them. Another group, hey, here's your usual set. We're going to study them. And what they noticed, again, what Rosenthal noticed at the end of that 16 weeks, again, very high ratings for those whose expectations were high. That is, that they scored really high on those proficiency tests. And their behavioral measures, the accuracy of their firing, the latency, how quickly they could get ammunition in and loaded, all kinds of behavioral things also showed better performance. You can see what I'm getting at. This audience extraction effect is a real effect. So, as if that's not trouble enough, when you're sitting around and watching and recording other people and trying not to share your expectations, if you're a mother-in-law or father-in-law, I'm sure you do that all the time. But if it's not hard enough, it's even harder to overcome this second feature about watching and recording other people, and that is to be selective in what you record and watch about them. The audience selectivity effect. Now let me say a little bit about selectivity. Selectivity, as the term implies, means you're not processing everything. You're choosing a couple things to look at and maybe ignoring others that could be germane or could be useful. You can see already the analogy to being a manager. You're sitting down in this performance evaluation situation I described in part 1, and you're giving your employee a performance evaluation, and they say, well, my goodness, yeah, you're right, but you missed X, Y, and Z over the previous 6 months. You missed it. What they're saying is that maybe there's some selectivity involved, and they're trying to help you out, which is entirely possible if you have 7 employees and you're trying to think of their behavior over the previous 6 months. Unless you're an extremely diligent manager where you create files on these 7 people and you add things every day and you don't miss, then who does that? My goodness, nobody does. There's lots of room for selectivity. But here's the thing about selectivity, even though I just pitched that as sort of a biasing effect in performance evaluations, in general, being selective is good. It's a normal and it's a functional process. I say it's normal and functional because, again, right now, I'm still sitting in front of my window. There's lots going on. There's people going by. There's my neighbors across the street. I see him talking to some guy. They're engaged in some kind of conversation. I have action inside the house. I'm at home now recording this. My kids just came home from school. On and on. There's lots. I mean, what do you pay attention to? You can't pay attention to it all. You have to select something. You have to devote your limited cognitive resources to something. And so what do you do? In general, we're not, in other words, the dispassionate and completely analytic consumers of information that we're often said to be, particularly by some economists. You know, we are often less than rational, certainly in what we select to process. There's a lot of great examples of this selectivity effect, and we'll talk about some of those. I want to give you a personal example. Maybe this will make my point better. In graduate school, I went to the University of Pittsburgh, and part of my assignment as a graduate student, and of course you do whatever you want because people are paying your tuition and you're grateful for it, as I was. I'm still grateful for the support I received. But my job was to work in Western Psychiatric Institute. It's a mental hospital associated with the University of Pittsburgh Medical School. And our clinical psych people were headquartered there, and it just happened to be my assignment, which I didn't like at the time, but now in retrospect I enjoyed it. What's really interesting, though, is I was on partly on the schizophrenic ward. It's a locked ward at the time, that probably still is. And these are people in pain. If you've ever seen, and I encourage you to go on YouTube if you want to see some interviews with various schizophrenics, and it's I mean, it's absolutely stunning. These people have trouble processing information. But what's interesting about it, I don't know if that's the right word, no, I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anyone. What's bad about it is that if you see these folks, they seem to be processing everything. They seem to have a lack of focus, particularly hebephrenic schizophrenic. They've changed the typing of schizophrenia now, but these are folks who have difficulty, and it's a very common characteristic of schizophrenia in general, of screening out stuff. In fact, one of the most effective, and in general medicine is not that effective, but one of the most effective drugs for schizophrenics are drugs that slow down the neuron firing in your brain and allow you at least more opportunity to focus. And so that's what these people do. They're looking all over the place. And so I guess what I'm telling you is the height of mental illness in our society, and in many societies, is the inability to be selective. So thank goodness we are selective. Thank goodness it's a normal and functional process. It does something for you. It allows you to focus in on things that are important, right? To prove this one more time, you're staring at an overhead here now, and the two planes in the upper figure are those are the F-22A Raptors. Those were designed to replace the F-117 stealth fighters, and went into service, I think, around 2005. They're Langley. They themselves, though, are being phased out now, and now the F-35, that Joint Strike Fighter, the one below, is the primary weapon platform for the United States Air Force, and is a competitor to on the market. You know, weapons are a big source of revenue. It's a big competitor with the Chinese J-20, which is also a stealth-like fighter. But my point in showing you these is that you think about jet pilots. It's $1.5 million to train these people on average. Really, really expensive. You generally don't have to motivate fighters. They love flying. They love flying, and it's really expensive to train them. So, but one of the interesting aspects about training is what's often called splatter vision. And you see this in other people too. You see it in people who are trained as customs officer, where tons of people going by, and you have to scan the environment very quickly. Well, the reason this is important in jet fighters, particularly these complex weapon systems, unbelievably complex, is that we have a tendency to be selective. And you don't want to be selective. You want to be looking at all kinds of things at all times and as much as possible to be alert. And unfortunately, that is not our natural want. In fact, it's natural for us to be selective. So one of the key things about training is training pilots to be non-selective. And that's the splatter vision, where you look all over the place. Splatter here, there. You take a view of various environments. So my point is that one way to prove that we are selective is that you have to be retrained out of that natural selectivity if you end up being a fighter pilot. Let me bring it back down to earth here, so to speak, and give you an example. Maybe many of you have seen this before. I'm going to show you a sentence, okay? And then I'm going to show you for about 10 seconds. I mean, most perception moves very quickly, right? And you don't have time to back up. You will here in the recording, so you can do that if you want. But I'm going to show you a sentence, and I want you to count the number of F's in it very quickly. Try to limit yourself to 10 seconds. And when I show you this sentence, put this recording on pause. In fact, try to identify right now where the pause is. I'm going to show you this sentence. Take a look at it, process it, and tell me how many F's you count. All right, I'm going to interrupt you already. I'm not going to allow you to cross-check. If you want to, put it on pause, but I'm going to continue this little litany about selectivity. If you look at this, a lot of people say 3, a lot of people say 4, some people even say fewer. But I don't know what you saw, but if we were all in person, we could actually do a little survey. And I've done that before. I've done that with some of my MBA students, and I'm sharing some data from a recent class here. When I ask people to count the number of F's in that sentence, nobody says 0, at least nobody says 1 either. A couple of people only saw 2. 4 people saw 3 F's, 8 people saw 4, 9 saw 5, and so on. 6 people saw 6 F's in that sentence. I don't know if you saw 6. Let's back up, because they're right. There are 6. There's an F, 1, 2 in the word of, 3 in following, 4 in factors, 5 and often, 6 and of. A lot of people miss the ofs. Well, if I was here, I could really pressure you to do this, and we'd have a better sense. But that's exactly what I did with these MBAs here a while ago, a couple terms ago, and that's what the data show. So why do I show this? Well, most perception is very slippery. It occurs in microseconds, and then what you're trying to stare at is gone, or what you heard is no longer, you can't regenerate, you don't have a recording. So in other words, perception moves very quickly. But the interesting thing about this F exercise is that everybody's looking at the same thing. That's a miracle enough. Of course, we already talked about what people choose to look at. But in this case, we all were looking at the same thing. There was something objective out there. Yet, even then, there's variance in perception. Now, this is a very narrow task. In real time, you're going to be doing a lot more. Perception's a moving target all the time, right? You don't have the luxury of rewinding and what did that person say? What did my boss say? You don't have that. You don't have unlimited time. In fact, quite the opposite. So if we can show that here, we're all looking at the very same thing, and yet there's still considerable variance in what people see. Wow! Doesn't that show you that selectivity is really important? All right, I'll do one more here. How many squares do you see? And if you look at this, a lot of people count 9, right? 1, 2, 3 by 3. It looks like a 3 by 3, but you know what? There's more than that. Yes, there's 9, but there's also the big one itself. That's 10. See that all the way around here? There's squares within here. There's 10. That's 11. Here's 12. It's a 2 by 2. Here's another 2 by 2, 13. Here's another 2 by 2, 14. You get my point. It's tough to get right, especially under time pressure. And again, I put people under time pressure in class. We can't do that here. But a lot of people will say 9, some 10, and a few will say 14. But you know, here's another aspect of perception. Not only looking at the same objective thing will people come up with different conclusions, like in the counting F's, but correct sometimes depends on the question. I asked how many you saw. So whatever you saw is the correct answer. Again, illustrating that perception is queen or king. It can trump reality. But the fact is there were 14 there, and it depends on what you choose to select. Now, here's one more, and I know what you're saying is the things I showed you and the circles and the contrast effects, they're artificial, they're unnatural, and you put us under pressure. You only gave us 10 seconds to do the F exercise. There's odd figures, but all right, well, let's try one more, and I'm betting that you won't be able to do this. I'm not going to show you the video, but I'm going to give you the URL in the next slide that you get. So once I get to the next slide, put it on pause and then cut and paste that URL into your browser. And what you'll see is it's a short video. It's a YouTube video. Maybe you've seen it before. It's getting more and more press these days. But I'm betting that you won't be able to do a simple thing. It's going to be a short video with a bunch of people in a circle, and they're passing basketballs. There's some people with white shirts on and some people with dark shirts on, intermixed. And boys, it moves fast, so you really have to concentrate on this. But I'm betting that you can't simply count the total number of passes that people have. And I believe the video asks you to focus on the people in the white shirts, and they intermix with these people in the black shirts. It's really tough. So it's tougher to stay in focus. So you really need to give your focus to this, and please do that. Please take a look at it. I'll put it up here now. Please put this on pause. If you're still hearing my voice, you need to put this recording on pause and then cut and paste this particular YouTube video. Okay? I'm going to pause for a few seconds. And now maybe you've already paused and you've already seen the video. If not, put it on pause, watch the video, and come back here, please. Boy, it's like I'm yelling at you, huh? All right, I'm going to shut up, give you a couple seconds pause, and maybe you're already back. Maybe you already watched it. So I don't know what you saw, but if you did watch it, and I hope you did, I think what you saw is a very, very normal, functional, selective process. When people are really concentrating on something and something's important to them, they miss sometimes obvious things. They miss the gorilla. So if you missed the gorilla, I did too whenever I saw this video first. And there are variations of this too, people doing different things with other stimuli walking through that are extremely odd. I miss those too, even though I was looking for them. But it is very natural. It's we're not these completely dispassionate, analytic consumers of information. We, in fact, are very selective processors. We focus in on stuff that's important to us. So what is important to us? Well, I mean, it varies all over the board. In our book, this is one place I think where our book does a really good job in perception, and they add a few things here. But here are some common methods by which selectivity operates. And you can see I've created a little funnel here. This is my rendition of the funnel. I'm not a very good drawer, as you can see, on PowerPoint. But this is supposed to represent a funnel. At the very top, at the widest possible area there are these personal constructs, and they get narrower and narrower as you get further and further down. So at the very top, let me explain these, not in a huge amount of depth because you're familiar with some of them, if not maybe some of you all of them. At the highest level, and these are things that affect, if you have one of these, they affect all people at all times. So if you have one of them, it's sort of operating, this selectivity thing is operating all the time and has a big impact on people. And it's called personal constructs. Personal constructs are your personal philosophies of the world, and they're really difficult to drag out of people, but eventually researchers are able to do this. And they're not very common. About 1 out of 10, even less than that, of us are likely to have a personal construct. But if you do have one, boy, it affects a lot of what you choose to pay attention to, what you're selective about. I'll give an example of a personal construct. In college, I worked in a factory. It was a cassette tape factory, and I'd have to lift these heavy rolls of tape up, and a lot of you probably don't even know what cassettes are, but they're the original recording devices, and oh my goodness, it was really hot, and it was really hard work. It really gave me an appreciation for being a professor, certainly, but being in a professional role. Those are really hard jobs. But what was really interesting was the manager of our unit, I think, had a personal construct. He never articulated, never said it, but you often have to infer from their behavior. And the personal construct, I don't know what the name of it would be, but it would be basically kind of people are evil. That was sort of his philosophy. And how did he show that? In all kinds of different ways, because personal constructs affect all kinds of different things. So he wouldn't trust people. He wouldn't acknowledge that your time card was accurate. He'd check it. He'd cross-check it. He'd look over people's shoulders. He wouldn't believe that if you gave people something, they'd do it. So he'd cross-check on that. He'd make a phone call to make sure the vendor got what they need. It was just a complete lack of trust. And so I think the way he constructed his world was that people are evil, and because of that, you got to monitor them and watch them. And so again, he never used those terms, but that was his behavior. So that's a personal construct. If you have one, it affects your perception of all people kind of at all times. That's personal constructs. Let's go down just a level below that, and it is narrower, and it's called a halo, and this is talked about in our book. A halo is also a selective mechanism for processing information about other people, and often they're talked about in a performance setting and a work setting. That's where they've been studied more often than anything else. But a halo is where you, as a perceiver, an audience, where you use one or a few traits to infer a more general impression on people. And so it's the use of one or more pieces of information to infer a larger set that may or may not be there. Right? And so you can see my example here. Let's say being on time is very important, as it was for my manager when I was in college. Very important, a key trait, and we all know people like that, and it's important. But let's say an employee is late to work several times. They could become subject to a halo. And a halo is where the supervisor uses one or a few pieces of information. In this case, being on late is really critical to her or him, right, as a manager. And then they infer other traits that may or may not be there. They might say, well, geez, they don't produce as good work as they should. They're not as good with customers either. And that may be true, but if you do that without information or without support, it could indicate a halo effect. So a halo effect is, in this case, where you could do no good. You get a little halo over you, a negative halo, and you can do no good. There are also positive halos too, though. You can get a piece of information that supports something that's important to you or you think is valuable, and then you infer other traits that may or may not be there that are associated with it. So someone gets a positive halo. They can do no wrong in that case. And these then can have a biasing effect on performance evaluations and so on. Okay, moving down a level. So personal constructs, they affect all people at all times. Halos affect all people at certain times. That's why it's a subset. Certain times only when they show that thing that's important to you. Well, stereotypes are even more narrower still. Stereotypes are the use of group membership to infer traits that may or may not be there. Now, a lot of people, I'm going to go back, I'll put this back up a second, I'm going to go back up. A lot of people, because stereotypes have been studied so much, and because they do, all these things have an impact on people, but stereotypes have a big impact on people and groups. People think that these are the sine qua non, the king or queen of active perceptual biases. But in fact, actually, they're kind of narrower relative to some of these other things. And again, stereotypes, the use of group membership to infer traits that may or may not be there. So personal constructs, all people at all times. Halos, all people under certain times. Stereotypes, some people under some conditions. You have to have that group membership. And so what are we talking about? We're talking about things like gender, as you well know, race, ethnicity, all the things that have been studied that you have also looked at. It is narrow because let's say I was in front of 35 people or so that are in class, and I had a halo. It would apply to all of you if you enacted that behavior. But stereotypes would necessarily affect a subset of you, only the women. So that's why it's narrower and down further in my little funnel here. Just to finish out the set, another selectivity mechanism are reputations. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, well, his reputation precedes him. And you know, what people are saying with that is that, look, and why it's a biasing effect too, an active social perception method. And what you're saying with that, which is his reputation precedes him, is you've not even met this person yet, and already you're willing to infer what they must be like. Now again, it could be accurate, could be inaccurate, and so on, but traits that may or may not be there, in this case based on reputation. You haven't even met them yet, and you've already inferred traits. But yet it's at the very narrowest level. It's specific, very specific people. And that's why it's at the bottom of that funnel. So there are lots of methods of active social perception. And, you know, not all of what we see as bias. I mean, remember, we like to watch and record other people. That's how perception's accomplished. And yes, we're subject to selectivity problems, but we do watch and record. So what are we watching and recording when we're watching and recording? A whole bunch of things, typically. Number one, we're looking at people's appearance. We look at nonverbal behavior. We look at something, maybe you're familiar with those first two, no doubt, but maybe you're not familiar with context, which affects what we watch and record. And then finally, actual behavior. I'm not going to talk about each of these in equal depth, but let me just mention something about each one. Let's look at appearance first. Now, what do we look at when we're watching and record? We do look at appearance. There's no doubt it contributes to perceptual judgments. And you know all the usual suspects. A lot of these things have made it to popular press, and they're in the back of airline magazines, they're in Reader's Digest, and people talk about them on and on. You know, clothing that people wear, you know, it's this tie, this suit, that suit, people's weight, people's physical attractiveness. Well, you know, despite all the popular press they get, in fact, they're the least important thing. And they do play a role, I'm acknowledging that, but kind of more on the tiny side. And in some ways, I'm happy that research shows this because it gives us as humans more credit than a lot of people give us, or that some think we deserve. Because, you know, someone putting on a red tie, a power tie, are we going to be wowed and for their on in the future think, oh my goodness, they must be powerful? And come on, as humans, we're bigger and better than that, right? It may have a little momentary effect, but my goodness, we can identify somebody who's an empty suit or an empty tie in that case very, very quickly. So that doesn't give people enough credit to say that, and the research shows these things don't have that big an impact. In fact, of all the appearance features, physical attractiveness actually carries the most weight, and even there it's constrained, because after you get to know people, that effect atrophies away. But it is sort of ironic, isn't it? Of all the things about appearance, it's the thing over which we have least control, physical attractiveness, that carries the biggest weight, even among this small weight category. So people have studied it. They've looked at the effect of physical attractiveness in a business setting, and you probably know some of this data. Physically attractive people are perceived as sociable and more intelligent. They're perceived as very sociable. It's almost like they have a halo, right? So physical attractiveness acts like a positive halo over them, and they all these other things are imbued to them, these pluses and benefits. And people have also studied in a business setting, and you see this more and more, particularly with Facebook coming online and people checking this as an employment condition, is people have done studies where they have identical resumes they send out, literally send out to companies, and then they note what happens. How quickly do they get acknowledgement? What kind of acknowledgement do they get? Is it an Autobot or not? What about the depth of acknowledgement? Do they even get callbacks? And so these resumes are often sent out, and they're identical in every feature except you'll have a physically attractive picture attached to the top and an unattractive one. And they used to be very common in applying for jobs, and now it's becoming more common too, particularly, as I said, with the advent of social media. Again, you see a plus there. But all right, well, appearance does play a role. A lot of nonverbal behavior plays a role. It plays a bigger role. Nonverbal behavior, as you well know, is not what you say, but how you say it sometimes. And, excuse me there, there are a lot of examples of nonverbal behavior, like how close you stand, when the distance you have between yourself and another person when you talk to them. And people have studied this across culture. What if you invade someone's space? Most North American males like around 2.5 to 3 feet between themselves and another male. A very reliable effect. Check it out sometime at work or in class, outside of class. You'll see it. Very reliable effect. But some Latin cultures like much closer space, about 1.5 feet between two males. So you might say, well, geez, what happens when you cross cultures there? One likes a closer space, one likes a farther away space. And people have speculated about that and done research. But the real point is, what kind of impressions do you garner when someone's in your face, perceived to be in your face, or perceived to be standoffish, like 3 feet away? Why is that American standing away from me? I don't understand. Or why is that Latin in my face? You can see what I'm saying. A lot of other behaviors too, nonverbal type behaviors. Touch is important. A lot of people who study are in hospitality management schools. One of the biggest is at Cornell University, another's at University of Central Florida. And they study a lot of touch, and they've done this too, where I don't know if you've ever been at a restaurant and your waiter comes in and kind of maybe sometimes even kneels down and kind of just touches your arm lightly. Hi, I'm Paul. How can I help you today, or can I give you any recommendations? So he did some interesting studies where there was a touch with that, right? Just a slight touch and then not. And he looked at the impact on tips between customers who were touched and those who weren't. And sure enough, those who were touched actually gave about almost 6% more in tips on average. People have studied facial expressions too. There seems to be some universal facial expressions, how people are surprised or depressed or upset. But all those have been studied, and they are clues to what other people must really be like. One of the things you're not familiar with when we're watching a recording is something that's much more subtle, and it's called context. Briefly mentioned in our book, but I'll say more about this. And in fact, here's what I want you to do first. I want you to put this recording on pause, and I want you to fetch that video I posted under this assignment called Hell Camp, and watch that right now. So please put this on pause. Watch that video. It's a 60 minutes, a brief video, and come on back. I think you'll find it's a study, it's a look at corporate training in Japan. Corporate training in Japan, which is very different than it is in the United States or in some other countries as well. And some of it's funny, some of it's uncomfortable and sort of heartbreaking, but I do want you to watch it and then come on back. So put this on pause. If you're still listening to my voice, you haven't put this on pause yet, so make sure you do that. And come on back then. Okay, if you're back, you've watched this video, isn't it very interesting? Boy, there's parts where people are laughing, and I really wish we could exchange our views, but let me share what other people have said about it in the past in in-person classes. Some people looked at it and they said, what in the wide world of sports is going on with the Japanese? I mean, they're nuts. What are they doing? Well, what they're doing is something that's common in Japan, and the companies pay thousands of dollars. You heard it on the video, thousands of dollars to send their middle to high-level executives who seem to have plateaued, you know, to these camps to improve, to expand their skill sets. And employees do that. You can see. Not every company does it, of course, but not everybody does corporate training in the U.S. either, or in other countries. But that's what these Japanese have done. And then what you saw is the Japanese went through these grueling sort of tasks. In fact, that British guy, that Brit, explained that he also went through it, and he relayed his experiences, and then they showed the video. But I don't know what caught your eye, but a lot of people often say, well, geez, why do people allow themselves to do this or to be subject to this? And what a weird set of training. What are they doing? Well, that may be true because it does jar with how we do corporate training. But let's look at what's going on here. The Japanese are and that's where context is really important. Context is very, very important. By context, it's important to look at the Japanese setting and compare it. Let's compare it with the U.S. setting. I see most people in class are U.S. students. How is corporate training done in the U.S.? Well, let's look at Japan. Many of the things that they asked these Japanese people to do were countercultural, right? They were countercultural. The Japanese just don't get up and shout, right? And they don't express themselves in very loud ways. It's inappropriate in that culture, right? And the Brits said that. You remember the common saying in Japan is the first person to raise their voice loses the argument, right? Well, it's exactly opposite in the U.S., isn't it? We have a common saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You know what that means? Hey, stand up, speak up. Even if you're wrong, go ahead, stand up, speak up. And that's, you know, you're no problem making a mistake, just be proud, right? So but it's diametrically opposed, right? The other saying in Japan is the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, right? You want to fit in better. So the Japanese are used to fitting in. And indeed, a lot of the training we saw that they got involved them standing out, something they're not good at, shouting, you know, laughing out loud, doing these other things, right? Well, what's really interesting is let's contrast that with typical training in the U.S., corporate training in the U.S. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but it's a very common thing. And I got some of these pictures actually from accounting, Big Four accounting sites. They often take their employees out and want to train them as a group. And so it's not uncommon for people to do outward bound type training, challenge type courses. So you can see here this group of the partner, I believe, and some junior accounting people. They're trying to operate this canoe together, and it's very difficult. You lose if you fall off or one person falls off, so the group has to work together. Here's another one, too, rapids, right? So this part of the firm, this particular subunit, which is also accounting firm, went out and did some rapid training too. And so why are people doing this? Well, a lot of them involve teaming together. Teams have to work together to climb walls, to do caving, to camping, to rock climbing, you know, all this stuff. Some are more inventive than others, but it doesn't matter. What people are typically taught, in other words, to do, it's not always. A lot of corporate training is very technical. Let's leave that aside, just as is in Japan. But when you look at behavioral things, quite often it's the reverse side of the Japanese coin. Japanese are really, really good at group things. They're taught that way to fit in from childhood. The U.S., Americans are taught to stand out. We're all very good. What we are said to have trouble with, and again, some of our foreign partners say this, is we have trouble working and playing well with others in other nations, right? So no surprise we have trouble working and playing well with others in small groups, which is, if you've ever been in a class where you've had group work, I think you know exactly what I mean, right? Some people slough off, you got to push it. Americans need to be trained about groups, right? So, yeah, that's kind of what's going on here. And so if you look at the subtle, the context, it's easier to interpret what's going on. In fact, I wish I had a video of American corporate training, like this, like I just showed you, some sort of outward bound training. If we showed it to the Japanese, they might laugh and they'd say, what in the heck is wrong with Americans? They have to be taught to work together? Well, what? So you see what I'm saying? It's the reverse side of the same coin, and if you understand context, you can better understand and better perceive what's going on. The context here is what's called collectivism individualism. This is based on one of the largest studies ever done in social science by a guy named Hofstede. He's mentioned in our book. Hofstede worked for IBM at the time, and they were in every country on the globe, as you might imagine, with a huge workforce, and they wanted to be better able to manage people in those workforces. So they commissioned them to do a study. The study ended up being over 160,000 managers in about 65 different countries. Hofstede's goal was to come up with almost like a biological taxonomy, but in this case of work values. Right? So how could you piece every country together, and what dimension would they be on? Kind of like a taxonomy, a classic taxonomy. So he collected all kinds of data from people. He had supervisor ratings. He videoed them. He had them give self-reports. He watched them serve. Took all this information and boiled it down via a complicated statistical technique called factor analysis. And out emerged underlying dimensions, which accounted for all the measures he took. One of those things that popped out was a dimension he called collectivism individualism. For example, that he found in his study that on average, the Japanese were the most collective society on the planet. Conversely, and I just show you 5 countries here, but he took all 65 and put them on this dimension, so I'm showing you some extremes. The U.S. was the most individualistic country in his study among those 65 countries. Now, in any one country, we know that people vary dramatically. There's shy people in the U.S., there's really, really outgoing, and ditto for Japan, but we're talking about mean differences here. And at the mean level, the U.S. is very individualistic. We train our kids to stand out. We train our kids to separate. You know, it's an axiom of parenthood, is you should grow up, be on your own, stand on your own legs, and then go away. That's not true of a lot of collective cultures. It's not true. If you take a look at the Spanish, for example, it's very common to live either with or very close to your parents. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, we had a Fulbright scholar. These are people that earn scholarships to come study in the U.S. and vice versa in other countries. We had one from Bilbao, Spain, and I think this professor was maybe, I don't know, 40, 45. And I remember at one time during lunch, it was early on in her time visiting us, she said, well, this is the first lunch I haven't had with my family in years. So she would leave work every day and have lunch with her family. Very close, very tight, very collective, right, where groups are very important. And so if you're working with another culture, and much of business is global these days, it's really important to have your perceptions correct and to get those straight. So context is like background. It helps you interpret what's going on. Right? If you ever heard someone say, you know, who was quoted incorrectly, well, they quoted me out of context, right? You've heard people say that. And what they're really saying is that if you have the proper background, you'd better be able to interpret what I said. And you really need that. That's what people beg us to consider. Well, that's what context is. It provides background. And in many cases, the background has a lot to do with, let's look at the cultural level, let's look at these high and low context kind of cultures. So if you look at high context cultures, those are very collective cultures typically, like the Japanese to a degree, the Chinese, the Mexicans, the Spanish to a degree too, in general. Low context countries are like the U.S., the Australians, the Germans. And so high context is where background is really important. It's important to have all kinds of information as you enter a deal. And so one of the things you see in these high context cultures is communication is very implicit. Some might say, incorrectly, it's indirect. Or people are being obsequious or not being clear. Well, typically those are the low context people who say that because their preference is for very explicit communication. Again, like countries like Germany, the U.S. Saying in the U.S., say what you mean and mean what you say, right? In other words, it's a John Wayne style of communicating, right? Very explicit. Well, that's not true of these high context cultures. Their communication is much more subtle, and that's what you want. If you're a very collective society, you don't want to be the nail that sticks out that offends other people. and it's a very close culture with lots of people on a very small island, so it actually is functional too. Let me give you an example of that, of this implicit, I didn't do a very good job at that, of implicit explicit communication. This is a very complex overhead, but let me try to explain it. Let's say you are in a negotiation with a Japanese potential partner, and you're talking about various parts, and you're down to maybe only 5 cents difference a part, but it makes a big deal when you're ordering maybe upwards of $1 million of these things. So you give an offer and or a counter offer, and your Japanese partner says that would be very hard to do. That would be very hard to do. You see that first one. That might be something they would say. Well, what might be the interpretation for a typical American? So let me answer for all the Americans in class. I would think that might mean, well, geez, hey, maybe we're getting somewhere. There's some adjustments are necessary, but I think we can still make a deal. They didn't say it was impossible, right? So I think that maybe we can still make a deal. Or what if the Japanese partner said 6 cents apart? Well, it would be very difficult. Again, my interpretation might be, well, the matter's difficult, but it's not impossible, so let's work at it. You'd stick at it. So what is the Japanese really saying when they say that would be very hard to do? Well, what they're really saying, in a subtle way, and if you understood their context, you'd understand that they mean no. No. What if they said it'd be very difficult? It doesn't mean it's not. It means no. What if they said, I'll consider it? No. Careful consideration. No, no, no. Silence. So all these mean no. In fact, I'll tell you all in class that I got this chart. I shamelessly stole it from a book by a Japanese scholar, Mida, and the title of the article was 16 different ways to say no in Japanese. The Japanese don't have an explicit way to say no, so they say it implicitly, as a low context culture would. You don't want to directly offend. Spoken agreements are also important. So to hash out those details, and someone else can do it later and work those out. Let's just get an idea that we're friends and we're working together. And as you probably know, Americans are obsessed with written agreements. One of the reasons why we have so many attorneys in the United States. The per capita rate of attorneys in the United States is bigger than any other country in the world. Pakistan, I believe, is number 2. Finally, a feature of context too is that, and particularly when you're doing business, it's important to know this, is in these high context cultures like Japan, personal relations add value. It's really important. It's informative. So when you visit Japan and your Japanese host, before you even start negotiating, takes you out. Next day they meet you and you take a tour of the city and you meet the mayor, you meet other people you think aren't really important. How are they going to play a role? But you go along with them. And then there's a banquet that night, and already there's 2 days gone, and the Americans feeling under pressure because they only got a ticket for 4 days. They thought the negotiation would be done. Well, some people know about Americans' impatience, and so they do that deliberately. But other people, this personal relation, seeing you on the golf course, seeing you at a banquet, and getting to know you better is really important. Now, to Americans, not so much. Not so much. Yeah, we like people and we like to socialize with them, but you know what? Enough is enough. Let's get down to business. Again, the John Wayne style you've heard people talk about. All right. Well, that's context. So context helps perception too, and if we knew that, it would help us watch and record better. We'd be better perceivers if we recorded context. Finally, and let's finish up here, and this is the end of what I have to say, not all of what we see is biased or really subtle. In many cases, what we see is what's actually there. And again, Americans prefer this maybe relative to others, but in other words, we prefer to watch and record actual behavior. You know, most people say, forget all that other stuff, man, it's unreliable and so on. Let's look at actual behavior. We actually have a theory about that, and it is described briefly in our book, and I want to review it and add a few things. It's called attribution theory. Attribution theory is a theory about how we collect actual behavior, what we collect, what we do with it, how we organize it, and there's a common set of things that we do, even though you may not use these terms, you guys. Let me scene set for you a little bit, though. If we jump out to maybe 20,000 feet, if you look at attribution theory, it's behavior. It's all about behavior. And it has a philosophy it's kind of based on, and maybe that would be, if I shared, this is my interpretation of it anyway, if I shared some of this, it would help give you some background about what this model is about. Number one, it's based on the pretense that we're asking a lot of why questions. Why did somebody say that? Why did they act that way? Why did they dismiss what I had to say? Why did they succeed? Why did they fail? We ask all kinds of why questions, including and especially, in fact, about people who are close to us, right? Our spouses, our kids. I have 2 kids, and I'm asking all the time. You combine that with our intense interest in watching and recording other people. We love it, right? We do it all the time. That we also ask those same why questions about them. Why are they acting that way? Now, here's the thing. I mentioned spouses. Now, I've been married a very long time, but you know what? Even somebody you're extremely close to, that you can never quite get inside their head, right? You don't know what exactly they're thinking. No matter how close, you just can't get inside their head. So recognizing this, we think that the best proxy for that is their behavior, right? Their behavior must indicate what they're truly thinking about and what they're really like down deep. So in other words, we use their behavior to attribute what they're really like inside. And that helps us form these impressions and so on. Now, it's a very complex theory with lots of sub-levels. Let's just stay at the very highest level. And I'll acknowledge here that it's much more complex, and they talk about that, but that's not that useful for us right now. Let's look at just the highest level. So they say then when we're trying to use behavior to infer or attribute what people must really be like, hence the name attribution theory, that we have a goal in mind. And our goal is to make attributions about them. Did they act that way because it's something about them? Or it's an internal attribution. Or did they act that way because of external circumstances, an external attribution? So that's our main goal at the highest level, and I'm not going to go any further than that. But that's the theory does again, but that's all we'll do. So how do we do that? And I'm sorry, I'm going to back up just a minute. Making an internal external attribution is really important. And follow this logic. Let's think about where I've come in these two lectures. I said that, boy, it's really difficult to even see the same thing, pick it out of the environment. Once you pick it out, it's tough to organize it. Once you organized it, it's tough to figure out what's going on, right? But so let's say, miracle enough, that all 3 of those things were accurate, and that everybody else thinks the same way. That would be a huge miracle, of course, because there's lots of loopholes in perception, right? But let's say that occurred. What you do with that information, the attributions you make, often affect your behavior. So in some ways, this is among the most important kinds of things. Let's say, in other words, we all agree. Let's say we have a set of managers and we're evaluating employees as a group, and everybody agrees that this guy had a really good year. Okay. So no problem in perception, selection, organizing, whatever. Everybody kind of agrees with it, right? But the attributions you make about why they succeeded, remember the why questions, determine what you would do, right? So why did they succeed? Well, maybe they got a really plum assignment, right? And everybody knew that. So what you're likely to do then is maybe devalue a little bit what they did, right? Or let's say that, yeah, you work in the small car division of Ford, and all of a sudden, in the last 6 months, gas prices spiked through the roof. Had nothing to do with you, right? But yet your unit succeeded. Are we supposed to give you a massive, raise and so on? You see what I'm saying? So attributions actually help shape what you do with information, and then affect how you're likely to act as a manager. So we use behavior to figure out what people are really like and to make this internal attribution. What sort of behavior? Now, the beauty of this theory, it says that we don't use any old behavior. That, in fact, we use 3 types of things. We look for, we seek out, and we collect 3 types of information. We may not use these terms naturally, but we do it. And they've shown evidence that it is pretty common across people, even if they certainly don't label what they're doing. So we use behavior to figure people out, not any old behavior. The first form of behavior we look at with the goal of making an internal attribution is what they call consistency. Consistency basically is how often does someone do something? How often do they do it, right? We have a really big lecture hall at UD here. You may have never seen it, I don't know. It seats about 280 people. Sometimes I teach this course in that lecture hall, and believe it or not, after marching through all this with me, maybe you wouldn't find it too hard to believe that occasionally people fall asleep as I'm talking, right? So what do you do as an instructor? I mean, do you blame them? Do you make an internal attribution? Or do you say, hey, it's maybe me or the circumstances, or it's hot, or it's whatever? You make an external attribution. Well, I do that. I mean, I look at these people, and you do want to make an attribution. So the first thing, according to these folks that I collect, the first thing I collect is consistency information. How often did they sleep? Did they sleep in this perception discussion? Did they sleep when I talked about groups, about motivation? How consistent is it over time? Now, if it's highly consistent, their behavior is highly consistent, they sleep repeatedly, I'm likely to, well, I've got one piece of information toward an internal attribution, but I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. And that's the difference between these people and the stuff these researchers I talked about earlier. These people believe that we are really rational, that we go through this full behavioral search, and then we put it inside of our head, and then we use some kind of calculus to reach a rational decision. So consistency, behavior over time. The next thing we look for, though, is consensus. Consensus is, what are other people doing, right? What are other people doing? So let's go back to that lecture hall example. So consensus can be high or low, and it can be very informative to me if I'm rational. Let's say it's just one or a few people sleeping, right? Consensus is low. Well, that's more evidence for an internal attribution. Not quite there yet, but if only a few people are doing it and the other 275 aren't, you can see what I'm saying, right? But say we got 20 people, 30 people, maybe the back two rows. How could I blame it on one person? How could I make an internal attribution to that one person I'm looking at? You can't. Consensus is really important. It's really important in all kinds of areas. It's one of the reasons we have benchmarks in finance, right? Yeah, hey, my mutual fund had a really great year. Well, really? Because, boy, look at all the other mutual funds in your same class. They produced 5 more points than you did, right? Or you hear this among day traders or people who do their own stock trading. You know, they say, oh, geez, I had a fantastic year. You know, I really did a really good job. I remember my neighbor one year told me he had 65% return. It was in the heyday in 05 or 06, I remember. And I had a fantastic year. And, of course, you know what that means. People forget their losses. They don't price their time. And they don't do all that. And, you know, we've already talked about selective memory. People don't remember failures. But let's take it for granted that he had 62% return. You know what? That year, I had a strong mutual fund before they sold out. And my strong growth fund returned 68%, right? And I wasn't on the machine all the time. I was on my deck with a beer and a cigar, right? You see what I'm saying? A rising tide raises all yachts, and that's why consensus information, what other people are doing, is really important. But we're not there yet. The third piece of behavioral information is a mouthful, and Kelly, the guy in our book who talks about this, called it distinctiveness. Distinctiveness is, how distinctive is your behavior? Is it specific just to this situation, my class, for example? Let's go back to the class example. Or do you fall asleep in lots of other classes too? Right? So now I have, according to the attribution theorist, the third piece of information I need. Right? And so if their behavior is highly distinctive, it's only my class, boy, it's hard to blame them. But let's say it's not very distinctive, that in fact they fall asleep in cost accounting. They fall asleep in operations research and other classes too. In some ways it's students' worst fear, by the way, where instructors compare notes. You know, hey, did Jim fall asleep in your class today? He did, boy, he did in mine too. And so that's what attribution theory says. And so let's look and review this and finish right on this point. To make an internal attribution, which is a really important determinant of how you would act as a manager, you look for 3 things. You look for consistency. And we have a tendency toward making an internal attribution if people do the same thing over time. Consistency is behavior over time. Consensus and distinctiveness, let's look at consensus first. Consensus is behavior across people. Is it across people in a very high way? If so, it's difficult to blame one or a few people. Distinctiveness is behavior across situations. So consistency across time, excuse me. Time, that's consistency. Situations, that's distinctiveness. And consistency across people, that's consensus. And when you see this particular pattern, you're likely to make an internal attribution and either blame someone for the failure or give them credit for the success. And that, again, has a huge determinant on their future behavior. So that's attribution theory, and take a look at that. It seems to have a lot of support, even though we don't use those terms clearly. I never use those, but I do attribution a lot. So just to put a final cap on this, one of the reasons to study perception, if it is fraught with difficulty, which I think you agree, that's the argument I've been making all along here, is that there's challenges at every level of information processing, from getting it in the first place, to making sense of it, to organizing it, to interpreting what it means, like attribution theory. So despite these challenges, we need really valid information. We don't want to be sued. We want to do the right thing. We want to give people the accurate evaluation. But yet, from personal to interpersonal to intergroup to across countries, there's challenges. Let me add one more challenge, as if you didn't have enough. The challenge I have for you is that over which you have more control. What are some of the tangible things that you could do to improve the accuracy of your perceptions at work? Tangible, specific. Don't need a lot of training. You can do it in a minute. I'm not saying it would always work, but it gives you a better chance of being more accurate. What are some of those tangible things? And maybe the way to think about it is in terms of performance appraisal, giving people credit for success. So as you go through this exercise and finish it, think about and mention some of those specific things. How would you be less selective? Right? Are we narrowing our search? How could you not narrow your search? Do we focus in on just a few people or groups? How can we avoid that? Think about that and use those as fodder for answering this particular assignment. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your attention, and see you again probably.